People say, with some justification, well, we wouldn't have been part of this if we'd really known the implications. Joining the European community did involve significant loss of sovereignty, but by telling the British people that was not involved, I think the rest of the argument was prejudiced for the next 20, 30 years. One breakfast I went to was a very chummy affair. We were all on the same side. We were all European propagandists. We were all fighting the European cause, to the extent that some of the protagonists actually drew Ian Trethowne's attention to broadcasters who they thought had been anti-European and asked him to do something about it. And I was so shocked that I decided I couldn't go again. It sounds terribly prissy, and I feel rather ashamed of being so biased, but it really did shock me at the time, and frankly, remembering it, it shocks me still.
Was it just a coincidence that Jack D'Manio ceased to present the Monday to Friday editions of the Today programme in the middle of 1971, while Geoffrey Tucker and his allies were turning the tide of public opinion?
There was a distinct shift of opinion, a measurable, substantial shift of opinion between the beginning of July and the end of July. And at that breakfast I said, we've done it.
Which must have been music to the ears of Edward Heath, the Prime Minister.
As that went on, so the support in public opinion polls steadily mounted, until when we got to the point of finally concluding the negotiation, we had just on 50% support, which was very considerable.
The Department in the Foreign Office, IRD, what were they doing in terms of keeping the debate going, keeping a flow of information going for you?
They were keeping the various departments and agencies informed as to how everything was moving outside in the contest. And it wasn't propaganda, it was proper information.
How helpful was the European movement?
Very helpful. They worked very hard, and they received funds from supporters, which enabled them to publish their own literature as well as ours.
We issued a newspaper called the...
Which you got a copy of?
That's right, I've got copies here, called the British European, edited by that famous cartoonist Philip Zick, and we distributed massive numbers of them freely. We used to have, for instance, in the summer, on the beaches, we had young women giving them away, and they used to wear T-shirts with the message "Europe or bust."
T-shirts, a newspaper, bumper stickers and posters, a pop song, not to mention breakfasts at the Connaught Hotel. Making friends and influencing people on this scale never comes cheap. So who was picking up the tab?
Within business and industry there was tremendous support and backing, and of course a great deal of money. I mean, the figure of £5 million has been bandied about in that period from 1771 in particular, which flooded into the European movement and to the Conservative Group for Europe.
One of the people who was very helpful in raising funds for us was Geoffrey Archer.
And who paid for the breakfast at the Connaught Hotel?
I think this was, you have to talk to Geoffrey Tucker, because he was the man who organized them.
Who paid for the breakfasts?
Well, I've never really had much knowledge of the funding, quite deliberately, but also because I'm not very good at that kind of thing. The European movement certainly paid for them. I don't know. I couldn't be certain about this, but I would guess that the European movement paid for most of them.
It's sometimes alleged that the funds that came to the European movement had come in often rather curious ways from the CIA in the United States. Is it anything you've heard?
Yeah, and I was absolutely astonished by it. I was rather tickled about it. Frankly, I didn't care where the money came from. I didn't know about it. It could come from anywhere, as long as it was there to do the job.
That allegation that the CIA were involved in promoting a united Europe. It was the simplest of questions which led to the most surprising discovery about Edward Heath's campaign to persuade the British people that to join the EEC was in their best national interests. who paid for the European movement, who financed the publicity campaign. Dr. Richard Aldrich teaches in the Department of Politics at Nottingham University, where he edits the Journal of Intelligence and National Security. And while researching the links between the CIA and the ideal of a united Europe, Aldrich found himself working in the library of Georgetown University in Washington.
I was absolutely astonished to discover that the library had the entire archive of a CIA front organisation, which documents from start to finish, funneling millions of dollars into Europe, into Britain, with all its accounts, with all its receipts, with correspondence, for example, from British Labour MPs to individuals in American intelligence organisations. And so I was absolutely astonished when I opened these dusty brown cardboard boxes, which weren't considered to be terribly important, and discovered one of the most exciting intelligence archives, perhaps, of the post-war period.
So if the CIA were bankrolling European Union, how come that no one noticed who was paying the piper?
The whole accounting structure of the European movement was designed to hide the fact that CIA money was coming in, and the way this was done was to have a core budget that covered the fairly mundane activities of running the European movement's office, paying for the cleaners, paying for the typewriters. All this came out of money that was generated in Europe, and the CIA money was hidden by putting most of the operational costs of the European movement, for example the European Youth Campaign, into these special budgets, which were not subject to the normal accounting procedures. It was possible to hide CIA money and indeed make sure that most people in the European movement were unaware that the CIA money was coming in. Very few people at the top were actually aware of where this funding was coming from.
Geoffrey Rippon, who's a passionate European, he knew, as I knew, that the battle for Europe wasn't over and probably never would be over, and that we would have to keep something like this going.
Do you still have breakfasts?
Yes.
For Europe or for other things?
I have breakfast for Europe, yes.
So the battle is not finally over?
The battle will never be over.
Nor the battle to influence the voters' opinion for or against the European Union. Lord Hattersley thinks that it was the way that battle was fought which has turned it into a 30 years war.
What we did throughout all those years, all the Europeans, was say, let's not risk trying to make fundamental changes by telling the hard truth. Let's do it through public relations rather than real proselytising. And IRD was always wanting to spin the arguments rather than expose the argument.
And that clearly, in your view, was the wrong approach.
Not only was it wrong for us to deal superficially with what Europe involved, but we've paid the price for it ever since. Because every time there's a crisis in Europe, people say, with some justification, well, we wouldn't have been part of this if we'd really known the implications. Joining the European community did involve significant loss of sovereignty. But by telling the British people that was not involved, I think the rest of the argument was prejudiced for the next 20, 30 years. People say, with some justification, well, we wouldn't have been part of this if we'd really known the implications. Joining the European community did involve significant loss of sovereignty. But by telling the British people that was not involved, I think the rest of the argument was prejudiced for the next 20, 30 years. People say, with some justification, well, we wouldn't have been part of this if we'd really known the implications. Joining the European community did involve significant loss of sovereignty. But by telling the British people that was not involved, I think the rest of the argument was prejudiced for the next 20, 30 years.